The fluorescent lights hummed their 4 a.m. hymn through the ICU corridors of Mercy General, that particular frequency that only existed in hospitals and interrogation rooms, a sound that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. Ashley Cooper had learned not to listen. She moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the economy of motion that came from somewhere deeper than habit, the kind of movement that used only the muscles necessary and left no wasted energy in her wake. Her scrubs were navy blue, wrinkled from a 12-hour shift that had somehow compressed into 8, and her badge clipped to her pocket read only her first initial and last name. A. Cooper. She preferred it that way. The antiseptic smell hit her nostrils as she passed the medication station, that chemical burn that never quite went away, no matter how many years you spent breathing it in. 23 years ago, Mercy General had opened its doors in Colorado Springs. Ashley Cooper had been breathing this air for exactly 6 months. Nobody asked where she came from. Nobody asked why her hands had those faint tremor scars across the knuckles, the kind that came from holding things too tightly for too long. Nobody asked why she limped slightly on her left side, favoring her right leg with the kind of compensation that took months of physical therapy to develop. The other nurses had stopped asking anything around week 2. They just watched. They just deferred. Room for 12 held a 10-year-old boy named Ethan Holt who hadn't moved his legs in 73 days. The riding accident had happened on a Saturday afternoon at a ranch 15 miles outside the city. A horse spooked, a fall, AC4 fracture that severed everything below his shoulders. Paralyzed from mid-chest down. The neurosurgeons had been very clear about that. What they had been less clear about was what a 10-year-old was supposed to do with the rest of his life now. His father, General Marcus Holt, 7th Marine Regiment, sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed most nights, his uniform pressed so hard you could cut yourself on the creases, his jaw set at an angle that suggested he was solving a tactical problem and the solution involved willpower alone. Ashley had seen that look before. She tried not to remember when. She entered the room at 05 for 7 hours without announcing herself. Ethan was asleep, his small chest rising and falling with the kind of shallow breathing that suggested he'd been awake half the night, staring at the ceiling tiles and counting them, which is what 10-year-olds did when they couldn't run and couldn't climb and couldn't do any of the things that made being 10 years old matter. Ashley moved to the bedside and began her neuro checks, the routine assessment that came before anything else in the morning, the foundation that everything else was built on. Pupil response. Grip strength in his hands. Pain response in his legs, though he couldn't feel it, though she ran the reflex hammer down his shin and he felt nothing at all. She'd been doing this 3 times a day for exactly 14 days, ever since she'd been assigned to Ethan's care on what had apparently been a random rotation but which felt to her like something else entirely. The heart monitor showed 87 beats per minute. Normal for sleeping. The oxygen saturation was 98% on ambient air, perfectly fine, no supplemental oxygen, no concerns. Everything was textbook acceptable. But textbooks were written by people who didn't spend night shifts in ICUs, and Ashley had spent more than a decade reading bodies the way other people read faces. She watched Ethan's chest for 3 full breathing cycles. The intercostal muscles, the muscles between the ribs, were beginning to retract slightly inward with each breath. That wasn't supposed to happen. That was the breathing pattern of someone whose lungs were working harder than they needed to, someone whose respiratory system was starting to labor, someone whose body was beginning to tell a story that the monitors hadn't figured out yet. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "Ethan. Wake up for me." His eyes opened. Confusion first, then recognition, then the particular resignation of a 10-year-old who had accepted that adults would keep asking things of him whether he could do them or not. "Hi, Miss Cooper. How's your breathing?" Not like you having trouble breathing, she'd learned not to ask yes or no questions because she'd learned that children would answer yes or no questions based on what they thought you wanted to hear, not what was true. "Tell me what it feels like." He thought about this, which was good. Thinking meant awareness. "Tight. Like sitting on my chest." He paused. "Is that bad?" It was bad. It was the kind of bad that lived in the space between normal and crisis, the kind of bad that the monitors wouldn't catch until it was worse. C4 fractures affected the phrenic nerve, the nerve that controlled the diaphragm. Ethan's spinal cord was severed at exactly the point where that nerve exits, which meant his diaphragm was paralyzed, which meant every breath he took was coming from accessory muscles that were never meant to carry that load for this long. She'd read his chart backward and forward during her evening break. She knew the neurosurgeon's assessment. She knew the statistics about what happened to children with C for complete spinal cord injuries over time. What she didn't know was whether today was the day his accessory muscles decided they were done. "I'm going to check something," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that suggested she was checking blood pressure when in fact her heart rate had climbed to 112 and her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running scenarios like a chess player who'd seen this board before. She adjusted his bed to a slight incline, not aggressive, not alarming, just enough to help gravity work with him instead of against him. His oxygen saturation was still 98%, but she could see it trending. 97, still acceptable. Still fine. Still the kind of fine that preceded not fine by 30 to 40 minutes if things went the way she suspected they would. The door opened. General Marcus Holt stood in the frame, still wearing his dress uniform from wherever he'd been yesterday, still carrying himself with the particular rigidity of a man whose body was always at attention even when his mind was breaking. He looked at Ashley. She looked at the monitor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Is something wrong?" His voice was command structure, the kind of voice that had directed hundreds of Marines and expected answers in complete sentences without filler. "His breathing pattern is changing. Nothing critical yet. I'm monitoring closely." She kept her voice in the register she perfected over 6 months, deferential but not submissive, competent but not threatening, the voice of someone who knew something but was offering it as a suggestion rather than a fact. She'd worn this voice through airports and grocery stores and every interaction that required her to be small. She was very good at being small. The general moved to his son's bedside. He reached out and touched Ethan's forehead, a gesture so human and so completely incompatible with the uniform that Ashley had to look away. This was the part she never got used to. The part where she understood that the man in front of her was both a decorated officer and a father who could do nothing to fix what had broken, and the particular agony of that combination was something she recognized in her bones. "Is he going to be okay?" The general asked this like he was asking a tactical question, like there was a right answer and a strategic response. "I'm watching him very carefully," Ashley said, which was not an answer at all, which was the only answer she could give him that wouldn't be a lie. She stayed in the room. She watched the monitors. The oxygen saturation drifted, 98, 97, 96. The heart rate climbed, 87, 95, 103. The intercostal retractions deepened, subtle but visible, the ribs pulling inward with each breath like the chest wall was caving in on itself in slow motion. She'd seen this before. She'd seen it in the field, in places that didn't have ventilators waiting and oxygen ready and backup systems in place. She'd seen young men with injuries that severed the nerves controlling their breathing, and she'd seen what happened when those nerves stopped firing and the brain forgot how to signal the muscles and the body simply decided it was done. But this was Ethan. This was a 10-year-old boy. And this was Mercy General in Colorado Springs, not Marjah, not a field hospital, not a place where the only option was watching someone suffocate while you held pressure on wounds that couldn't be fixed. At 0621 hours, Ethan's oxygen saturation hit 92%. His breathing had become visible labor, his entire small chest working now, shoulders rising and falling, neck muscles engaged. He was frightened. She could see it in the widening of his eyes, that particular panic that came from the body knowing something was wrong before the mind caught up. "It's okay," she said, and she meant it in a way that only someone who'd been through something like this could mean it. "We're going to fix this. I need you to breathe for me. Can you do that?" He nodded, trusting, the way children trusted when they had no other option. She moved. Not running created panic, but the kind of swift, decisive movement that came from muscle memory, from training, from a decade of moments where hesitation meant people died. Her locker was in the staff room, 2 minutes away. She kept things in that locker that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. A pair of worn combat boots wrapped in newspaper that she touched once per shift, just enough to remember, not enough to break. A small kit of supplies that she'd assembled over 6 months, slowly, carefully, the kind of kit that no one asked about because no one paid attention to what nurses kept locked away. Inside that kit was MRE packaging, meals ready to eat, the kind of waterproof, durable plastic that she'd carried through 3 continents and that worked on a principle nobody in Colorado Springs needed to understand. She was back in room 412 in 90 seconds. Ethan's O2 was at 88%. She'd done this in field conditions without anesthesia, without sterile kits, without the luxury of time. She could do this with all 3 things available. Her hands were steady, the tremor that had lived in them for years was gone now, replaced by the particular clarity that came when the moment required it. She positioned the MRE packaging over his chest, shaped it with the precision of someone who understood the mechanics of penetrating trauma and pressure equalization. The chest wall needed to breathe. The lungs needed to expand. The packaging would seal the wound that wasn't there but that her tactical brain understood needed sealing. She secured it with medical tape. 4 points. Anchored. Stable. Just breathe, she said to Ethan. You're doing great. Your lungs are going to remember how to work. Just let them. His oxygen saturation stopped falling. 96%. 97%. He breathed. The mechanism of his breathing had shifted, she could see it, could feel it through her hands on his chest, the load redistributing, the accessory muscles getting help, the pressure inside the chest cavity normalizing. His heart rate began to steady. His eyes unclenched. The code team arrived 4 minutes later, alerted by the automatic oxygen saturation drop alarm, ready for crisis, expecting emergency. What they found instead was a 10-year-old boy breathing normally, oxygen saturation at 97%, vital signs stable, a nurse standing beside his bed with her hands at her sides, her expression neutral, her voice already explaining what had happened in the crisp, clinical language that made it sound like she'd simply recognized a problem and implemented a basic solution. Which was exactly what she'd done. The code team lead, a resident named Chen who'd been at Mercy General for maybe 14 months, looked at the improvised chest seal, looked at Ethan's stable vitals, looked at Ashley with an expression that suggested he was trying to solve an equation that didn't add up. What is this? He gestured at the MRE packaging. Chest seal, Ashley said. Oxygen saturation was dropping. Intercostal retractions indicated increased work of breathing. This redistributes pressure, assists his compromised respiratory mechanics. His O2 has stabilized at 97% for the last 3 minutes. Did you call respiratory therapy? They're on their way. This stabilized him in the interim. Chen was quiet for a moment. He studied the seal again, then looked at his monitors, then looked at Ethan, whose small chest was now rising and falling with ease instead of effort. I don't think that's protocol. No, Ashley agreed. But his breathing. That's what matters right now. General Marcus Holt was standing in the corner of the room. He was watching her. In that moment, Ashley understood that she'd made a tactical error, not in the procedure itself, which was sound, but in revealing that she knew how to do things that civilian nurses weren't supposed to know how to do. The general's eyes had changed. They'd moved from gratitude to recognition, the way a soldier's eyes changed when they saw another soldier, when they saw someone who'd been somewhere and done something that required more than standard nursing training. She met his gaze for exactly 1 second, then looked back at the monitor. The heart rate was 94 now. The breathing was steady. The crisis had passed before it became a crisis, which was the entire point, which was the thing she'd learned over a decade of doing things that couldn't be written in reports or explained in deposition or defended in any context that required her to tell the truth about who she was and where she'd come from. Dr. Pierce arrived 40 minutes later, after the code team had stood down, after Ethan had fallen asleep again, after Ashley had documented everything in the chart using only the language that Mercy General understood. The chest seal had been replaced with proper medical tape. The improvisation had become invisible. But Dr. Pierce knew something had happened. She could see it in the way his eyes moved across the monitors, the way he read the chart twice, the way he looked at Ashley with an expression that combined suspicion and something else, something that looked like threat. "Walk me through this," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who wanted to catch you in an inconsistency. Ashley explained the breathing pattern change, the oxygen desaturation, the stabilization. She used only clinical language. She made it sound like she'd simply noticed a problem and waited for help to arrive. "Code team responded to your alarm call," he said. It wasn't a question. To the automatic O2 alert. "But you were here before they arrived." "Yes." "And you stabilized him." "I monitored him." He closed the chart. "Don't improvise, Miss Cooper. Call respiratory. Call me. Follow protocol." "Of course, doctor." She said it the way she'd been trained to say things to people with authority over her schedule. But something had shifted in the room, something that had to do with the general standing in the corner, still watching, still quiet, his expression now locked in the particular containment of someone who'd just recognized something he couldn't quite name but absolutely understood. The general left the hospital at 0800 hours, still in dress uniform, still at attention. He stopped at the nurse's station, asked for Ashley's full name, wrote it down in a small notebook that he kept in his breast pocket. She watched him from the medication station, her hand steady, her expression neutral, her mind already running ahead to the afternoon shift and whatever came next. What she didn't know was that in 17 minutes, General Marcus Holt would make a phone call to someone in the Pentagon. What she didn't know was that in exactly 48 hours, that conversation would trigger a classified inquiry that would eventually bring down everything she'd tried to escape by walking away from the uniform and into the quiet anonymity of Colorado Springs. But that wasn't now. Now, she had a shift to finish and a boy to watch and the particular knowledge that she'd just done something that had saved a life, and that in doing so, she'd revealed enough of herself that staying invisible was no longer an option. The nurse's station at Mercy General was a controlled chaos of beeping monitors and paper shuffling when Dr. Pierce arrived at 1340 hours, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile with the precision of a metronome. Ashley was restocking the crash cart supplies 3 feet away, her movements economical and practiced, when his voice cut across the room, loud enough for every staff member within 20 feet to hear clearly. "I'll give you all something entertaining," he announced, gesturing toward her with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced consequences. "Our mystery girl here just got assigned to the general's kid. Ethan Holt. 10 years old. Paralyzed from the waist down." He paused, letting the gravity settle. "I'm betting she quits within a week. Any takers?" He pulled out a dry erase marker and wrote across the whiteboard in aggressive capital letters, "Ghost Girl, 7 days." The letters were crude, almost violent. Around the station, nervous laughter rippled like wind across still water. A few staff members exchanged glances. Most looked away. Ashley stopped mid-motion, her hand still gripping a roll of gauze. She turned slowly, her body angled toward him but her face perfectly blank, the kind of blank that contains everything and reveals nothing. She held his gaze for exactly 5 full seconds. Her eyes were a storm gray color, and in that moment, they looked like they could freeze water. She didn't say a word. Didn't smile, didn't protest, didn't show a single crack. She simply returned her attention to the crash cart and continued her work as if he hadn't spoken. Pierce's smile faltered. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The laughter around the station died like a radio being turned off mid-song. He turned away, but his movements were stiffer now, less fluid. One of the senior nurses, Marjah, who'd worked at Mercy General for 16 years, caught Ashley's eye and gave her a nearly invisible nod of acknowledgement. That night, Ashley sat in her studio apartment on the edge of Colorado Springs, the kind of place that came furnished and anonymous, exactly as she wanted it. The walls were bare. There were no photographs, no personal effects beyond what fit in a duffel bag. On the small kitchen table sat her laptop, open to nothing in particular. She stared at the dark screen and felt the familiar weight of her own silence pressing against her ribs like a stone. The next day, Tuesday, 1215 hours. The hospital cafeteria was packed, the kind of crowded where 100 conversations blend into white noise and nobody really knows who's watching whom. Ashley carried her lunch tray through the maze of tables, a salad, bottled water, nothing that required utensils or time. She'd learned years ago to eat with her back straight, her plate balanced, her attention divided between the food and the exits. Pierce sat at a table near the central passage, the prime vantage point. He was with 2 other physicians, both laughing at something he'd said. As Ashley passed his table, moving carefully through the narrow space between chairs, his leg extended casually, a subtle movement that would look accidental to anyone not watching precisely. Her tray hit the ground. The plastic plate shattered. The salad exploded across the tile in a spray of lettuce and dressing. The water bottle rolled, leaving a trail like a snail's path. The sound of impact echoed through the cafeteria. Conversation stopped. 200 pairs of eyes found her in an instant, the way a crowd always knows when something has broken. Pierce didn't look up from his phone. He didn't acknowledge what he'd done. His associates continued laughing, though the sound had taken on a nervous edge. Ashley crouched slowly, her movements controlled, and began collecting the pieces of shattered plate. A passing intern offered to help. She waved him off with a small gesture, handled. As she gathered the last fragments, Pierce finally spoke, his voice loud enough for the nearest tables to hear clearly. "Careful, ghost girl. Wouldn't want you to hurt those magic hands." He said it with a smile, the kind of smile that looked like kindness to anyone not paying close attention. "Heard you were pretty good at fixing things. Don't want you damaging your tools." Ashley rose slowly, the broken plate fragments balanced in her palm. She looked at him directly, her expression unchanged. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that the nearby tables had to lean in slightly to hear it. "Accidents happen, doctor. Some people never recover from them." She wasn't looking at him when she said the last part, she was looking at the tile floor, at the spreading water that was beginning to pool. "Depends on how much damage gets done." She turned and walked away, her spine perfectly straight, her pace unhurried. Behind her, she heard one of his associates ask Pierce if he'd meant to do that. She heard him laugh, a forced sound, like an engine trying to turn over in winter. The third incident came at 0630 on Wednesday morning, before the hospital had fully woken. Ashley had spent the night shift monitoring Ethan Holt, checking his neuro status every 2 hours, watching the subtle changes in his breathing pattern, the way his pupils dilated slightly during REM sleep. She'd filled out her patient charts with meticulous detail, documenting a slight increase in fluid accumulation around his lower thorax, something his previous scans had flagged as concerning. She was walking out of his room with those charts pressed to her chest when Dr. Pierce rounded the corner from the opposite direction. He moved with the speed of a predator, his eyes locked on the papers in her hands. "Those are mine," he said flatly. It wasn't a request. It was a command. "I need to file these," Ashley began, but he was already reaching, his hand moving with surgical precision. He didn't ask again. He simply took the charts from her hands and threw them down the hallway with the kind of force that belonged in a different kind of fight. The papers exploded across the floor like white birds scattering. They drifted across the tile, some sliding all the way down the hallway and under a supply cart. Ethan's daily intake records, his medication log, her assessment notes, all of it scattered across 30 feet of corridor. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Pierce's voice was the voice of someone who believed he'd already won. "That's what you're good for." Ashley watched him with that same flat, dead stare she'd perfected over 6 months in Colorado Springs. Her hands didn't clench. Her breathing didn't change. Her face revealed nothing, no anger, no humiliation, no fear. She simply stood there, her presence like a stone in still water, immovable and solid. When Pierce had finished panting slightly from his exertion, when he turned to walk back down the hallway expecting her to crawl after the papers, she spoke. Her voice was quiet. It was also somehow louder than anything else in the hospital. "Your insecurity is showing, doctor." He froze mid-step. Behind them, a nurse's aide and 2 resident physicians had turned to watch. The charge nurse stood in a doorway, her eyes wide. Ashley turned and walked away, her movements precise and unhurried. She heard Pierce's breathing become rapid, heard a sharp exhalation of anger behind her, heard him start to follow. But he stopped. He always stopped after she spoke. Because saying anything more would require him to address what she'd actually said, and that was a conversation he couldn't win. The gathered staff whispered as Ashley continued down the hallway. She didn't look back. But she heard one of the residents say to the charge nurse, "I've never seen anyone stand up to him like that." And she heard Maria's measured response, "Neither have I." And she did it without raising her voice. That was the moment when something shifted in the hospital's perception of Ashley Cooper. She was no longer just the quiet new nurse with the mysterious past. She was the quiet new nurse with the mysterious past who somehow made the most powerful man in the cardiology department look small. That afternoon, Dr. Pierce began making phone calls. The first was to Chief of Staff Morrison at 1,430 hours. Pierce spoke in measured, professional tones about concerning protocol deviations and unprofessional conduct in the workplace. He mentioned that he felt uncomfortable with Ashley's assignment to his patient. By 15:10 hours, the call schedule had been restructured. Ashley's shifts were moved to nights only. Her ICU access was revoked except for Ethan's room, a tightly controlled corridor that limited her interaction with other staff members. The second set of calls came at 1,645 hours. Pierce spoke to the 3 nurses who'd shown her kindness, Maria, the intern who'd offered to help her in the cafeteria, the charge nurse who'd defended her in the hallway. By the next morning's schedule posting, they were all reassigned to different floors. Maria, who'd worked pediatrics for 8 years, was moved to geriatrics. The intern was pulled to trauma. The charge nurse went to obstetrics. It was surgical. It was documented. It was devastating. The third stage of his campaign was technological. By Thursday morning, Ashley discovered that her ICU access codes no longer worked except for Ethan's specific room. The crash cart on the pediatric floor had been relocated, moved to a storage area on the opposite side of the hospital, supposedly for space optimization. When she paged the on-call physician at 2,147 hours on Friday night, the call didn't go through. She paged again, left a voicemail that went unanswered. Only later would she discover that Pierce had altered the call routing during the schedule restructuring. All her pages went to a disconnected number. All her messages went nowhere. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next would change everything. The 0620 hours staff meeting convened in the third-floor conference room at Mercy General. Dr. Pierce sat at the head of the polished table like a man who'd already won. His hands were steady. His voice was measured. He didn't need to shout. The documentation spread before him told the story he wanted told, a narrative of recklessness, of protocols violated, of a nurse operating dangerously outside her scope. He opened a folder and began distributing copies. Each page was a small knife, precise and clean. The incident occurred at approximately 2,240 hours last night, Pierce said, his tone suggesting regret rather than accusation. The Holt boy experienced acute respiratory distress. Code Blue was initiated appropriately. However, Nurse Cooper made an unauthorized clinical decision. He paused, letting that word hang, unauthorized. She performed an invasive procedure without physician oversight. Without orders. Without even waiting for the code team to arrive. The Chief of Staff examined the folder. Charge Nurse Halloway sat rigid in her chair, jaw clenched. Pierce continued, his voice smooth as oil on water. Hospital Bylaw 7.2.3 explicitly require physician authorization before any invasive airway procedures. JCAHO standards mandate clear chains of command during emergencies. The medical board has specific guidelines about scope creep in nursing practice. This was textbook scope creep. He turned a page. But that's not the complete picture. He began listing other violations. Minor ones. The kind of infractions every nurse accumulated over years. Ashley had charted a medication note 15 minutes after the window closed. She'd used non-approved abbreviations in progress notes. She'd taken a break in the staff bathroom instead of the designated break room. She'd accessed patient records outside her assigned floor. Each item was documented. Each had a date, a time, a witness name. He'd been building this file for weeks, maybe longer. Every small mistake had been catalogued and saved like ammunition in a magazine. "I'm not suggesting these individual infractions warrant termination," Pierce said, his voice suggesting the opposite. "But together, they demonstrate a pattern. A pattern of judgment that prioritizes her own decisions over institutional authority. A pattern of carelessness about protocol. And now, she's crossed from carelessness into genuine endangerment." The chief of staff looked up from the folder. "She saved the boy's life." With an improvised technique that could have caused additional harm, Pierce responded immediately, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this objection. "The MRE packaging chest seal is field medicine, not hospital medicine. There's a reason we have sterile equipment, established procedures, controlled environments. What works in combat doesn't work in a pediatric ICU." He leaned forward slightly. "The boy could have developed infection. The seal could have failed. The pneumothorax could have worsened. She gambled with a child's life because she didn't wait for proper medical authority." Holloway's voice rose. She knew the code team was 6 minutes out. The boy was desaturating. Which is precisely when a nurse calls for physician support, not when she performs thoracic procedures. Pierce cut her off, his voice still calm but carrying the weight of institutional authority. "Those are the rules. They exist for reasons." The room went quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed above them like fluorescent lights always do, oblivious and eternal. Ashley stood at the back wall, having been summoned 15 minutes earlier. She'd been told it was a routine debriefing about the emergency response. She hadn't expected this ambush disguised as procedure review. She watched Pierce work the room the way a surgeon works anatomy, with precision, with knowledge of where every pressure point lived. "I'm requesting her immediate termination," Pierce said, closing the folder with deliberate finality. "Effective immediately pending administrative review." The chief of staff rubbed his temples. "Nurse Cooper, do you have anything to say?" Ashley could have spoken. She could have explained the physiology of decompensation, the mathematics of oxygen saturation, the fact that 3 minutes of hypoxia in a child could mean permanent brain damage. She could have described what she'd seen in Marjah, soldiers dying from tension pneumothorax, from simple pneumothorax, from collapsed lungs that emergency surgery could have fixed if the surgery had come in time. She could have told them that she'd performed the exact same procedure on adults and children in conditions infinitely worse than a climate-controlled pediatric ICU. She could have revealed that she'd served as a combat medic with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, that she'd earned 3 Purple Hearts by knowing how to improvise, how to keep people breathing when the proper equipment didn't exist. Instead, she said nothing. The silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that belonged to her, disciplined, controlled, a silence that suggested she had nothing to defend because nothing had been done wrong. It was also a silence that suggested she had secrets she wasn't going to share. The room couldn't quite interpret which. General Marcus Holt entered without knocking. He moved like a man accustomed to doors opening before he reached them. He wore his dress uniform and carried the weight of 32 years of command. His eyes found Pierce immediately. "I want to know why my son's life-saving nurse is in this office," the general said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand phrased as a statement, which was how generals always phrase demands. Pierce stood and smiled, a careful smile that suggested respect for rank while maintaining professional authority. "General Holt, we appreciate your son's recovery. Truly. But hospital protocols exist for patient safety. We need to ensure every procedure meets our standards." "Your standards?" The general's voice dropped to a pitch that made the room's air pressure change. "Your standards almost let my son die. Nurse Cooper didn't follow your standards. Nurse Cooper saved my son's life. So before we talk about protocols, why don't you explain to me why you're sitting here instead of thanking her?" Ashley watched the general's face. Searched it for recognition. Found none. 9 years had passed since Marjah. 9 years since she'd been a different person, younger, harder, certain. 9 years since this man had ordered her court-martialed for a decision that had saved 8 lives but violated direct orders. She'd disobeyed him. He destroyed her career. And now he was defending her. The irony hung in the air like a bad smell. Pierce's composure didn't crack, but something shifted beneath it. He'd been outmaneuvered. A general in dress uniform caring about a nurse's actions created a public relations problem he hadn't anticipated. He pivoted smoothly. "General, I respect your perspective. However, procedure violations are procedure violations, regardless of outcomes. If we allow circumvention of protocol in emergency situations, we undermine institutional authority. And institutional authority is what prevents chaos." The general looked at Ashley. "Is that what happened, nurse? Did you violate protocol?" She met his gaze directly. "Held it." Her voice came out low and steady, the kind of steady that came from having survived things that broke normal people. "I kept your son breathing until the code team arrived. Everything else is discussion." The general nodded slowly. Recognition flickered across his face, not recognition of who she was, but recognition of what she was. Recognition of a soldier's answer to a soldier's question. He turned back to Pierce. "So she did what was necessary. And she's being fired for it." "Terminated for protocol violation," Pierce corrected. "The outcome, while fortunate, doesn't justify the methodology." What happened next didn't involve shouting. It involved authority. The general pulled out his phone and called the Secretary of the Navy's direct line. He did this while standing in the conference room. He did this while Pierce watched his career options collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Sir, this is General Marcus Holt. I'm calling to report that Mercy General Hospital in Colorado Springs has just terminated a nurse for performing a life-saving emergency procedure on my son. Yes, the procedure worked. Yes, the boy is stable. No, the hospital administration disagrees with the value of his life." The Chief of Staff stood up. "General, perhaps we should discuss this in." "You're going to tell the Secretary of the Navy where you'd like to discuss this?" the general asked. He returned to his phone conversation while maintaining eye contact with the Chief of Staff. "They're reconsidering." "Yes, I'll hold." The meeting adjourned. Not officially. Not with any statement. Just the physical fact that no one remained seated and the general was on the phone with the highest-ranking officer in the United States Navy and Pierce had stopped breathing normally. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened in the hours after. Pierce didn't argue or appeal. He simply got to work. He called the hospital board at 0630 hours, spoke to 3 board members by name, used his tenure and reputation like currency, leverage earned over years of making himself essential. He didn't request Ashley's firing. He'd already lost that battle. Instead, he requested schedule modifications. He needed nursing staffing adjusted due to census projections. He cited budget concerns. He mentioned accreditation reviews. His voice through the phone was calm reason. Hospital administration loved calm reason. By 0800 hours, the nursing schedule had changed. Charge Nurse Holloway, who defended Ashley in the meeting, was reassigned to the 4th floor cardiac unit. Her shift moved from days to nights. The transfer was technically a promotion, more responsibility, better positioning for advancement. It was also exile, and Holloway understood this perfectly. She texted Ashley, "I tried. I'm sorry." Nurse Martinez, who'd brought Ashley coffee that morning, was moved to the pediatric emergency department. Different floor. Different schedule. Different everything. Nurse Chen, who'd worked the code with Ashley and witnessed her competence firsthand, was reassigned to the ICU night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The shift nobody wanted. The shift that meant no contact with her family for weeks. Nurse Pritchard, who'd asked Ashley questions about the improvised chest seal afterward, was transferred to orthopedic surgery. So far from the ICU that they might as well have been in different buildings. By noon, Ashley's entire support network had been systematically dismantled. The nurses who might have defended her, who might have offered perspective, who might have offered coffee or conversation or basic human acknowledgement, no longer worked her shifts. They no longer worked her floors. They no longer existed in her professional ecosystem. Pierce hadn't fired any of them. He'd simply redistributed them, like pieces on a board being moved by a player who understood the game's geometry. Then came the access restrictions. Pierce called the IT department and requested modifications to the nursing database. Routine request. Normal administrative procedure. He needed certain nurses restricted from accessing patient records on specific floors due to scheduling conflicts and confidentiality concerns. Ashley's credentials were flagged. Her ICU access was limited to direct patient care only, meaning she couldn't review charts, couldn't study cases, couldn't prepare for shifts, couldn't do any of the preparatory work that separated competent nurses from reckless ones. The restrictions were perfect because they were technically defensible. They were subtle because they required no dramatic gesture, no public firing, no visible confrontation. They were strategic because they isolated her not through action but through structure, the architecture of an institution slowly closing doors until she had nowhere left to stand. He also documented everything. The chest seal procedure was added to her permanent file with a red flag, unauthorized invasive procedure. Her protocol deviations were compiled into a formal report, pattern of non-compliance. Her chart abbreviations were listed with citations, deviation from institutional standards. Her access to the staff bathroom was noted as unauthorized break location usage. He was building a case that would survive any legal review, any union question, any attempt at reinstatement. He was building a case that would follow her to the next hospital, the next job, the next attempt at anonymity. And Ashley watched this happen without flinching. She came to her shifts. She did her work with the same precision she'd always demonstrated. She treated patients. She followed every protocol perfectly, understanding that perfect compliance was the only shield available to her. She didn't complain. She didn't appeal. She didn't call her sister or her old unit or anyone who might have helped her. She simply endured. But on the third day, after her ICU access was restricted and she realized she'd been boxed into a corner with no walls visible until it was too late to escape, she went to her locker at the end of her shift and removed the combat boots. The worn pair she'd kept hidden beneath her personal belongings. She held them in her hands and looked at them the way a person looks at proof of a life she'd been trying to leave behind. Then she walked out of Mercy General and didn't come back. The coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago. Ashley Cooper sat in a booth at the Crossroads Diner on the edge of Colorado Springs, watching the cream form a thin skin across the surface like something dying slowly. The fluorescent lights above flickered at the same frequency as the surgical lamps in the Marjah Field Hospital, and she couldn't stop noticing it. Couldn't stop noticing anything anymore. Her reflection stared back from the dark window, hollow-eyed, gray-skinned, the kind of exhausted that sleep doesn't fix. The waitress, a woman with kind eyes and tired shoulders, refilled the cup without asking. Ashley didn't acknowledge her. Didn't reach for it. Just watched the new coffee steam rise and dissipate into nothing, the same way everything else in her life had. 6:22 in the morning. That was when Dr. Pierce had walked into the emergency staff meeting with his documentation folder already open, his confidence moving through the room like a blade. The board chairman sat at the head of the table. Pierce didn't wait for an invitation. He stood, clicked the projector, and her personnel file appeared on the screen. Her photograph. Her name. Her job title. Terminated for cause. Miss Cooper engaged in gross violation of medical protocol, Pierce had said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who'd never been interrupted. She improvised a procedure using non-sterile materials, MRE packaging, to be specific, on a critical pediatric patient without authorization or physician oversight. The chest seal she fabricated was reckless endangerment by definition. Yes, the patient stabilized. Yes, he survived. That doesn't justify the danger she created. He'd click to the next slide. His documentation was meticulous. Every protocol deviation she'd ever committed, catalogued and itemized. A missed notation here. A delayed chart update there. Administrative minutiae elevated to the level of criminal negligence. She has demonstrated a pattern of operating outside her scope of practice, Pierce continued. She has shown defiance to medical hierarchy. She has compromised patient safety protocols. The hospital's liability exposure is unacceptable. Ashley had sat in the back of the room, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't argue. Didn't defend herself. Didn't tell them that she'd trained for 8 months as a combat medic before becoming a registered nurse. Didn't mention the 16 field surgeries she'd performed under fire. Didn't say that the MRE packaging technique was a standard emergency procedure she'd used to save 7 Marines in a collapsed bunker near Marjah in 2011. She'd walked away from all of that. Chosen a quiet nursing job where nobody knew her name or her history. Chosen to be small. The silence in that conference room had felt like a living thing. Pierce waited for her to speak, his expression morphing into something close to confusion when she didn't. She just looked at him with a jaw clenched tight and eyes that revealed nothing. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Much worse. Effective immediately, the board chairman had said, "Your employment at Mercy General is terminated. Security will escort you from the building." She'd stood without a word, walked out, and didn't come back. Now, at 3 in the morning in a trucker-stop diner between somewhere and nowhere, Ashley traced the rim of her cold coffee mug and thought about disappearing again. It would be easy. New city. New name. New job where nobody looked too closely. She'd done it before. The PTSD made it simple to run, trauma gave you permission to abandon things. To start over. To become someone else. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wallet. Not from fear. From restraint. From the effort of not driving back to Mercy General and telling every person in that building exactly who they'd just fired. But that person belonged to another life, and she'd buried her long ago. She pulled out her driver's license, found the newspaper clipping folded behind it, the court-martial proceedings from Marjah, dated March 2012. The newsprint had yellowed. The headline read, "Lieutenant Commander Ashley Cooper charged with insubordination following medical decision that violated chain of command." She'd kept it as a reminder of why she couldn't go back. The decision had been simple. 12 Marines lay wounded in the forward operating base after an IED detonation. The commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel named Marcus Holt, had given orders, prioritize the most salvageable cases. Protocol. Triage. Save the ones most likely to survive. Leave the critical cases for evacuation to the main hospital. It made tactical sense. It obeyed direct orders. Ashley had looked at those critical cases anyway. Looked at a 19-year-old lance corporal bleeding out from a severed femoral artery. Looked at a sergeant with a sucking chest wound and minimal breath sounds. Looked at 5 more Marines who would die in the time it took to evacuate them, and she'd made a choice that ended her career but saved 12 lives. She'd operated for 18 straight hours. Performed open resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta on 2 patients, using a technique she'd learned from a trauma surgeon in Iraq. Field sutured lacerations that would have been left to bleed otherwise. Improvised. Adapted. Broke protocol. The Marines survived. The tactical mission was compromised because she delayed the unit's departure. That violation of direct orders, her choice to save lives instead of obey commands, had resulted in a court-martial board finding her guilty of insubordination and recommending her discharge. General Marcus Holt had signed the order that destroyed her military career. And yesterday, she'd saved his son using the exact same judgment. The cruelest irony wasn't even irony. It was cosmic mockery. She'd spent 18 months in a combat hospital with her hands steady and her decisions clear, and she'd spent 6 years since then with nightmares that came like clockwork and hypervigilance that turned a shopping trip into a threat assessment. The things that made her good at saving lives in Marjah made her dangerous in a civilian hospital. Made her unable to sleep. Made her unable to stay. She ordered more coffee at 3:47 in the morning and didn't drink that one either. Just sat in the booth and watched the sky begin its slow turn from black to grey. Dawn came like an apology nobody had asked for. The trucker in the booth across from her was snoring, his head tilted back, a half-eaten plate of hash browns cooling in front of him. The waitress was wiping down the counter with methodical precision. The world continued. People lived their small lives in small diners on the edge of small cities, and nobody had any idea that the person sitting in the corner booth was the same person who'd been court-martialed for being too good at keeping people alive. She paid cash for coffee she didn't drink and walked out to her car. The parking lot was still mostly empty. Her reflection in the windshield looked like a ghost. By 9 in the morning, Dr. Pierce was calling an emergency hospital board meeting. He'd anticipated General Holt's complaints. He'd prepared his documentation. He'd weaponized every protocol deviation and built a narrative that would protect him from scrutiny. He didn't know that Mercy General's routine background check for termination paperwork would flag a classified security clearance still active in the federal database. He didn't know this would trigger a military liaison notification. He didn't know that Colorado Springs had a Northcom facility just 18 miles away, and that someone in uniform would take notice of a decorated officer's child being treated at a hospital where his defender had just been fired. He walked into that board meeting with his confidence intact and his case airtight. He had no idea that everything he'd built was about to be disassembled by his own competence in believing he was untouchable. The room filled with hospital administrators, legal counsel, board members in blazers who looked like they'd never seen combat or consequences. Pierce clicked through his presentation. His slides were polished. His argument was clean. His documentation was flawless. He was winning. Then the back door opened. A man in digital camouflage uniform stood there. Behind him, another in dress blues. Behind him, a third in the dark suit of someone who didn't need a uniform to convey authority. General Marcus Holt stepped forward, his posture that of someone accustomed to giving orders. With him came Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the field medic from the military hospital in Germany where Ethan had been treated before arriving in Colorado Springs. Rodriguez looked at the personnel photo on the projection screen and his face went completely white. "Sir," he whispered to General Holt. "That's Lieutenant Commander Cooper." The room went silent. The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights hum like power lines carrying electricity from the sun itself. General Holt stared at the photograph. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "That's impossible." Cooper was discharged. "No, sir," Rodriguez said. "She resigned. Different paperwork. Voluntary separation. There's a difference." The hospital chaplain, a retired Marine named Father Michaels, pulled out his phone, cross-referenced something on the hospital's personnel database against information he seemed to already know. When he spoke, his voice shook. 2nd Medical Battalion, 1st Marine Division, Marjah District, 2011 to 2012. 18 months combat deployment. Treated over 300 casualties during the insurgent offensive. The whispers started. Board members leaning toward each other, pulling out phones, verifying. The Admiral stepped forward then, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star for Vela. Navy Cross pending review at the time of her voluntary resignation. He looked directly at Pierce. She operated a forward surgical unit under direct fire for 6 consecutive days during the Marjah campaign. Pierce's confident smile had begun its slow collapse into something that looked like panic. Then the door opened again. A man in a dark suit, no insignia, carrying a thin folder. He addressed only the board chairman, his voice low and precise. "Her file is partially classified. I can tell you that she operated under the code name Nightingale during several Joint Special Operations Command missions. She has presidential-level commendations I'm not authorized to describe in this setting." He turned to Pierce. You fired one of the most decorated combat medics of the last decade for using the exact techniques that saved hundreds of American lives. The general's field medic stood in the hospital boardroom at 0900 hours, his jaw working silently as he stared at Ashley Cooper sitting in the metal folding chair. His lips moved. One whispered word came out like a prayer, "Nightingale." The room went dead silent. Dr. Pierce shifted in his seat, confused. He didn't understand the reaction. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. The field medic, a man with sergeant stripes and scarred knuckles, took one step back, his entire posture changing from aggressive to reverent in a single motion. Father Michaels, the hospital chaplain with the silver cross and the eyes that had seen Kandahar firsthand, pulled out a worn leather notebook. He didn't need it. He knew. His hands trembled as he opened it anyway, cross-referencing the service dates written on his intake form against the entries he'd made himself during Ashley's first week at Mercy General. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of 17 years in Navy dress blues. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, he said. His voice was steady now, measured like a man speaking in church. Deployed to Marjah, Helmand Province, 2013 through 2014. Unit history lists critical medical interventions during Operation Enduring Freedom. 14 emergency procedures conducted under fire. 12 Marines alive because of, he looked up at Ashley, his eyes glistening. Because of you. Dr. Pierce's hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table. The wood creaked under the pressure. A visiting admiral from Naval Medical Center San Diego sat 3 chairs down. His uniform was a river of ribbons, blues and golds and purples representing 42 years of service. He adjusted his reading glasses and pulled out a single sheet of paper. His voice was the kind of voice that had command authority baked into every syllable, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard across a crowded room. Purple Heart. First Award, 2013. Shrapnel wound, left shoulder. The Admiral's eyes met Ashley's. She didn't look away. Purple Heart. Second Award, 2014. IED fragmentation, lower left abdomen. A pause. Silver Star. 2014, combat medical operation under sustained fire, Sanjin Valley. Citation reads, extraordinary heroism in action while serving with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, conducting emergency medical procedures while under enemy fire, directly saving 12 American service members. The room felt smaller. The air felt like it was being compressed by the weight of what was being said. Dr. Pierce opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Then the man in the dark suit from Langley, the one nobody had asked permission to bring into the boardroom, spoke quietly into his phone. He waited 30 seconds. Then he looked at Ashley without expression. Codename Nightingale. 2012 through 2015. Classified operations across 3 provinces. 47 documented interventions. 0 friendly casualties under your medical protocols. His eyes were like cold steel. Your security clearance is still active. Your service record is still sealed. But it's being unsealed, effective now, with your permission. He paused. We believe that's the right call. Dr. Pierce stood up. His chair toppled backward, clattering against the linoleum with a sound like a gunshot. His face was crimson, not red, crimson like a flag, like blood, like something that had already surrendered. This is a conspiracy. A setup. That woman, his voice cracked. He pointed at Ashley. His finger shook. She deceived this hospital. She endangered patients with unauthorized procedures. Nobody responded. The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the fluorescent lights that had witnessed nothing of what mattered, that had always been neutral observers in a room that had just become holy ground. By 1700 hours that same day, desperate to control the narrative before it controlled him, Dr. Pierce called Channel 7 News. He offered them an exclusive. He framed it as a security concern, a military operative posing as a civilian nurse, using unauthorized combat techniques on hospital patients, creating liability for the institution. The newsroom beat. By 18:30 hours, Pierce was sitting in a makeup chair while a technician covered the sweat on his forehead with powder that wouldn't hold once he started talking. The interview began at 1900 hours during prime time for million viewers across Colorado and Wyoming. The anchor was Melissa Torres, a woman with a kind of face that showed no mercy and no judgment simultaneously. She let Pierce talk. He built his case carefully: deception, violation of protocol, the dangers of military procedures unsuitable for civilian medicine. He sounded almost reasonable, almost credible, almost innocent. Then Melissa touched her earpiece. Her eyes widened. "Dr. Pierce, we have a live caller. I'm told this is the Secretary of the Navy." Pierce's jaw tightened. His hands gripped the armrest of the studio chair. A voice came through the speakers, a measured, calm voice like water flowing across stone. It belonged to Secretary Michael Richardson, a man who had nuclear subs under his command and congressional committees waiting for his testimony. "This is Secretary Richardson. I need to correct several dangerous misstatements made on your program." The voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. Lieutenant Commander Ashley Cooper did not deceive Mercy General Hospital. She exercised her right to privacy as a veteran with honorable discharge status. The chest seal procedure she performed using emergency materials is taught at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. It's the standard protocol at Cleveland Clinic. It's what we teach at Walter Reed because it works. A pause that lasted 3 seconds. This woman saved a child's life using techniques that earned her the Silver Star in combat. Dr. Pierce fired a decorated war hero for excellence under pressure. Silence in the studio. Pierce's mouth opened and closed like he was drowning in air. The Navy stands ready to provide Lieutenant Commander Cooper legal counsel should she pursue action against Mercy General or Dr. Pierce personally for wrongful termination and harassment of a disabled veteran with service-connected trauma. This call is being recorded. The line went dead. The studio filled with the kind of silence that comes before earthquakes. Melissa Torres turned to Dr. Pierce with professional sympathy. "Doctor, would you like to respond?" He couldn't. His face was crimson turning to purple. He ripped the microphone from his chest, leaving a small tear in his shirt. He stood. He walked off set without looking back. His shoes clicked on the floor, the only sound in a room that held 4 million invisible witnesses. The footage went viral in 20 minutes. By 2100 hours, the hospital board had suspended Pierce pending investigation. By morning, 3 major news networks were requesting interviews. By the end of the week, Pierce's clinical privileges at Mercy General were revoked permanently. The documentation he'd so carefully built, every protocol violation he'd documented, every incident he'd recorded, now formed a clear pattern of harassment and retaliation against a veteran employee. The same documentation he'd wielded as a weapon became the instrument of his own destruction. Within a month, Pierce was working at Quick Care Urgent Clinic in a strip mall on Powers Boulevard between Nail Paradise and Cloud9 Vape Shop. He treated strep throat and sprained ankles and minor lacerations. He made a third of what he'd made at Mercy General. Nobody called him Dr. Pierce anymore. Everyone knew what he'd done. Everyone knew what he'd lost by doing it. At 1745 hours on a Friday 6 days after the broadcast, Ashley stood in the Mercy General parking lot at sunset. The Rockies turned purple and gold behind her, mountains like they were on fire. She held the pair of worn combat boots she'd kept hidden in her locker for 6 months. The leather was cracked. The laces were frayed. But they'd walked through Marjah, and they'd walked through Colorado Springs, and they'd carried her this far. For 6 months she'd been running from the uniform. From the nightmares. From the weight of lives held in her hands, the weight of decisions made under fire, the weight of coming home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with people who'd seen what she'd seen. She'd put on scrubs and chosen a hospital where nobody would know her name or her history. She'd thought that silence could heal. It hadn't. General Marcus Holt approached across the parking lot. His uniform was dress blues, perfectly pressed. His gait was the gait of a man who'd walked through deserts and across continents and through his own mistakes. He stopped 10 feet away, giving her space. "Lieutenant Commander Cooper," he said. "May I speak?" Ashley nodded once. "I was wrong," the general said. His voice didn't shake, but it carried something deeper than sound, something like regret moving through stone. "In Marjah, I prioritized mission security over medical judgment. You saved 12 Marines that day by violating my direct orders. I court-martialed you for it because I couldn't admit my orders were wrong. I was wrong." His eyes were older now, marked by the weight of command, by the weight of sending people into fire, by the weight of mistakes that could never be unmade. "Last week you saved my son using that same judgment. That same willingness to violate orders because the cost of obedience was death. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me help you however I can." Ashley looked at the boots in her hands. The leather was warm from the Colorado sun. She thought about Marjah. She thought about the diner at 3 in the morning. She thought about the silence she'd chosen. "I left because I couldn't carry it anymore, sir," she said quietly. "The nightmares. The weight. I thought if I disappeared, if nobody knew my name, I could just stop being what I was. Stop remembering." The general nodded slowly. "And did it work?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. The boots felt heavier than they should have. "No," she said. "Then maybe," the general said, "it's time to stop running." The next morning, Ashley reported for her first shift back at Mercy General. The board had offered full reinstatement with back pay, a formal apology, and a commendation. The charge nurse had organized a staff petition, 36 names. Father Michaels had arranged counseling through the VA. Rodriguez visited twice a week. Ethan Holt was in physical therapy, his paralysis less severe than initial scans had suggested. The quick intervention Ashley had provided had prevented the oxygen deprivation that would have ended all hope of recovery. He would walk again. She wears the boots under her scrubs now. Not hidden. Not ashamed. She wears them like they're part of her uniform. In the nurse's station, someone had written on the whiteboard, "Nightingale, thank you." Ashley erased it quietly and began her rounds. On the roof at 0200 hours during her break, she stands alone looking at the stars. She lets herself remember Marjah without running from it. She lets herself remember the Marines she saved, the orders she violated, the court-martial she accepted. She lets herself remember who she was, not as something to escape, but as something that made her capable of saving a general's son when every other doctor had given up. The boots on her feet feel like they belong there. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. And comment, what would you have done in Ashley's position?